welcome to my tutorial on how to use masks and layers for non-destructive editing. Today I'm going to go over things like creating new layers, using masks, when to use them, how to group these things together, and give you the basis for an overall workflow that's going to set you up for success and efficient retouching. Today I'm going to use an example that I made with a model from a while back, and as you can see here, the background itself has a splash of light from the window off to her left. In the original image, I really liked that. However, today I'm going to remove that using layers and masks to show you how I would go about cleaning this up in a non-destructive way. And what non-destructive means is that every edit that you make is not affecting the actual source image itself. You're using layers and masks as building blocks to build up to the final image of whatever you're trying to achieve, but still having the original information in the lowest layers of the image, just in case you need to go back and make adjustments, delete something, lower the opacity on something, raise the opacity on something, work a layer further. It's just a really good way to make sure that if you need to make adjustments, if a client requests adjustments after you send them an image, you're not having to start from scratch or having to pull information out of something that doesn't exist anymore because you've obliterated it already. So the first thing we want to take a look at is the way that Photoshop sets you up by default. Over here on the right-hand side, you have a layer called background. And as you can see, there's a little lock on there, which means that you're not going to be able to make any changes on it. And that's good. We want to leave it that way. So the first thing I need to do to remove the light from the backdrop is to create a new layer. There's a couple of different ways that I can go about removing the light. I can use the clone stamp tool, I can use the heal tool, I can use content fill aware. In this case, that's the way I'm going to go. I'm going to use content fill aware. It's going to get me to the result I'm looking for a little bit faster. And since it's all the same area and all grouped together, that just seems like the most efficient way for me to do this. The clone stamp tool and the heal brush can work on a new blank layer, but the content fill aware needs a layer that already has information in it. So what I'm going to do is just duplicate a copy of my background layer, and I can do that using the shortcut Command J, or on a Windows machine, it is Control J. And as you can see, it's made a layer called background copy. I'm actually going to change the name of this layer to content aware fill. It's really important to name your layer so that you know what you've done to the layers if you need to come back to it later. I cannot stress this enough. Please name your layers. And you can do that simply by double-clicking on the name that's there and then typing in whatever it is that you would like to call the layer. I don't want you guys to get hung up on how I'm removing the light on the backdrop. I just want you to get a feel for how layers and how masks work. I'll cover things like content fill aware, clone stamp, heal brush, things like that in other tutorials. But the most important thing for you to learn right now to take away from this tutorial is layers and masks. Layers and masks. Just concentrate on the layers and the masks. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get my lasso tool, and I'm going to go ahead and do a rough selection around the area with the light. And I'm going to do content fill aware, which the keyboard shortcut for that is Shift F5. Again, don't worry about it, but since we're doing it, it's Shift F5. And as you can see, it did a terrible job, as content aware fill tends to do. A lot of people think that content aware fill is a one-shot job. It usually is not. If it is, you got lucky that time. So I'm going to go ahead and deselect that area and select the smaller mess that it made and run it again. Getting a little bit better there, but still a mess. And then I'm going to select it and run it again. All right, get closer. Now, there's nothing that's going to fix this area that I've selected because it's running into where her body is and there's too much textures and Photoshop is not that smart. So I'm just going to run it one more time to see how much smaller I can get that area so that I don't have to do as much work to it. All right, that's probably as close as I'm going to get it. So I'm going to go ahead and deselect that. Now, right now, what we have are two different layers. You've got your background layer. If I click this eye, it's going to turn off my top layer. So I've got my background layer, the original layer with the light that's showing, and then the new layer with the mostly clean background, but a little bit of a mess around her waistline. So what you need to do now is think about layers as a stack of papers, okay? You've got the background layer is the bottom piece of paper, and on top of that, you've got the content-aware fill piece of paper. So you've got two pieces of paper stacked on top of each other, and this is how they look. Now, to make things a little more complicated, this is where the masks come in. It's really easy once you understand it, but when you first try to understand how a mask works, it can be deceptively confusing. So the best analogy that I can come up with to explain how masking works is to think about a sheet of transparency film. So if you guys are as old as I am, you might remember the overhead projectors that teachers used in school or that companies used in presentations. Now we've got fancy digital projectors, but back in the day they had overhead projectors, and the way that those worked is that there was a clear sheet of transparency paper and they would use a dry erase marker to draw on it, and they would put it on a bed of light that would then project onto a screen or a wall or something like that. So think about the clear sheet of transparency paper that we have here. Okay, and we're going to apply that by clicking this mask button, and it pops itself onto the content aware fill layer. Now keep in mind, I'm going to undo this real quick. You need to make sure that the layer is selected. So if I click on background layer, you see that it gets highlighted a lighter gray. So I need to make sure that my content aware fill layer is the one that's selected, and then click the mask layer. And this white box appears on the same layer as the content aware fill layer. So now when you're thinking about your stack of paper, you've got your background layer on the bottom, followed by your content aware fill piece of paper. But taped to the top of that piece of paper is a clear transparency sheet. And that clear transparency sheet is what is allowing us to see what is underneath it. So when you're working with the masks, you have two different colors that you're dealing with. If I select the mask itself versus the actual image, if you see here, the image is selected. There's 4 brackets around each corner. You want to make sure the mask is selected. So I'll click on the white box, and now it has the 4 brackets around it. When you click on the mask, your brush colors automatically change to white and to black. So white is the color that will allow you to see whatever is on that layer. So right now we can see everything on the second layer because the box is entirely white. If I were to make the box entirely black, suddenly everything that we've made happen on this layer with content aware fill is hidden. So I'm going to go ahead and change it back to white, and now everything that we've done with content aware fill is revealed again. And so when the box is black, think about taking a black marker and just completely coloring in that black transparency. And now you can't see anything that you've done on that layer. Now, where the analogy starts to fall apart is technically if you have a black piece of transparency paper on top of a stack of papers, you're not going to be able to see anything underneath it. But that's just semantics. Let's just worry about this one layer right here. So when you black out the mask, anything that is on this layer that you've done to it will be hidden. But when it's white, it shows through. So now what I want to do with my clear white sheet of transparency is clean up this mess that I've made down here at the bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in. And if we turn this layer off again, this is what it's supposed to look like. But again, we've made a mess with content aware fill, and this is what it currently looks like. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that my mask is selected, which it is, And I'm gonna make sure that black is my foreground color for my brush. The shortcut for brush on the keyboard is B. And to switch your foreground and background colors, you can hit X on your keyboard. And I'm just going to paint black on my mask to hide what we did with the content aware fill and to reveal what is on the layer beneath it, which is what it should look like. Now, obviously, if I go over the edge here, we start to bring back that light there in the background and some of it right here, but we'll take care of that in a moment. And so now if we look at my mask, and only the mask, this is what we have. So we've got this big white sheet of transparency with this tiny little black blob in the bottom. So that means everything on this content aware fill layer is showing through, except for where this black part is. And that's where that mess appears. If I were to hide the mask real quick, that's where this mess appears here. So painting black over it doesn't allow that portion to show through. But the rest of what we've done where the light was is showing through because that's still white on the mask. So how do we fix the area near her waistline that we've brought back by painting it black on the mask? We're going to create a new layer. And this time the layer can be blank because I am going to use a clone stamp tool on it, which can work on a blank layer. So I'm going to hit Shift Command N, or on a PC it's Shift Control N, and I'm going to name this background clone stamp because we always name our layers. And you can see that that now appears on the top of the stack of our papers. It is a blank layer. That is why we've got these kind of checkered marks there. That's to signify that there's currently nothing in the layer. There are no pixels. There's nothing happening. That's okay. I'm going to hit S on my keyboard to bring up my clone stamp and make sure my brush settings are correct quickly. All right, and then I'm going to zoom it down here, and I'm going to just select using the Option key an area near where I want to fix, and then start brushing that in. I'm just going to sample frequently. Again, don't worry too much about how to clone stamp. I'll cover that in a different tutorial. Right now, we're just worried about understanding layers and masks. Since this layer is on top of everything else that I've done so far, the mask underneath is not affecting what I'm doing in terms of clone stamping. All right, so that looks pretty good. So now if we zoom out, the background no longer has that light leak from the window. I no longer have some weird blob happening down by her waistline. I've cleaned up the background where we brought some of the old image back from the masking. So if we look at the original, here's where we were, here's where we are. And if you look, when I flip back and forth, I realized that I've missed part of her arm here while we were bringing back that mask. So this is where the layers and non-destructive editing really come into play, because I didn't notice that until I did my before and after comparison. But because I have everything on a separate layer, I can actually go back, reselect my mask, make sure that my brush is black, and cover up what that content fill aware did to her arm. If I had a flat image that I was working on, that might not be possible. So again, we can go back into before and after. And there we go. So let's forget we did all of that just for a moment. And I'm going to go ahead and create a new layer as if we're going to do content aware fill from the very beginning. Okay, I'm going to do this again just real quick. I want to show you what happens if you don't work in layers and with masks and you work destructively instead of non-destructively. Okay, so we've got this happening here. Now, let's say, okay, well, this is terrible. We don't want this happening. Just like last time, you know, content aware fill kind of messed up around her waistline. So let's say I take my eraser brush instead of a mask, and I'm working on this same layer that I just made. And I start to erase to reveal the layer underneath, which you think would be fine. But then what happens is you push the image too far and you're saying to yourself, oh no, I need to bring that back because now I've got this lightly coming back in. Well, guess what? You have no option to bring that back because when you look at just that layer by itself, you've created a hole in the image. Remember, the checkered pattern means that there's no information there anymore. It's completely transparent. Well, I can't paint that back because there's no information there. Whereas if I use my mask, let's go ahead and bring back what we did do. I could technically, if I want to grab a white brush, redo or re-expose what it was that we did. Now, obviously, I don't want to bring that back because it looks terrible, but that's the beauty of having a mask versus working destructively on a layer, because you can always bring back what you've done by either using the white or the black brush. Okay, let's get rid of that example layer that we did. Go back to what we had. So this looks really cool. But let's say we want to change the color of the background now. So we can do this by using something called a adjustment layer, which is located down here in the bottom right. And I'm going to go ahead and click and choose hue and saturation. Now, something I like to do while I'm working is to also create folders. That's another element of layers, if you will. Let's say I want to keep the color adjustments that I make separate from the removal of the light. What I can do is click on one of the layers that I use to fix the background. And then if I hold Shift down while clicking on another layer, it will highlight both layers at the same time. Then what I can do is come down here and click the folder button. And now I've made a group. And I can name that group Light Removal. All that does is keep those things together, so that way if I want to adjust them at the same opacity level or the same blending mode, or I want to turn them on and off together at the same time to see a before and after, I have the ability to do that. You don't have to use folders if that's confusing to you right now. However, it does really help with organization, so I would recommend doing that. So let me go ahead and show that so you can see what I've been doing. So I'm going to hit my hue and saturation layer. So right now, as it is, if I take the hue slider and I change it, it's going to affect the entire image. And why is that? Because our mask is completely white. And if you hadn't noticed, the mask automatically attaches itself to the hue and saturation layer. All of the adjustment layers come paired with a mask automatically, so you don't have to create one using this button. All you have to do is select the layer type that you want. So if I select the actual tool here and I'm sliding my hue slider, the model and everything else in the image also changes colors, which is what we don't want. So I'm going to go ahead and reset that. In order to fix this, what we need to do is mask her out so that only the background is affected. Again, don't worry about how to use the selection tools. I'll cover that in a different tutorial. I'm going to go ahead and do a rough selection on her by clicking select subject, and then I will refine it a little bit. I'm not even going to really worry about making sure it's absolutely perfect, because again, the focus of this specific video is not about how to make clean selections. It's about layers. Okay, good enough. And so now what I'm going to do to mask her out, I can do a couple of things. I can take my brush, first select your masks. I can take my brush and make sure the foreground color is black, and I can start to just paint in within the selection. And of course, it doesn't look like anything's happening over here, but look off to the right-hand side and you see there's a black blob here on the mask because that's where I've painted. The other thing that I can do, if I undo that, I can make sure that black is in the background. And then I can just hit delete on my keyboard. And what that does, if you look at the mask over here, is completely fill the selected area with the background color. So if we look at just the mask, that's what we have. Okay. And now what I can do is I'm going to go ahead and deselect my model, and I can go and grab the hue and saturation slider, And now just my background is changing color. And again, the reason that this works and only the background is changing color this time is because if you look, the mask is white where the background is, which is allowing us to see the changes of this layer, and black where the model is, which is saying, hey, we don't want to see this effect in this specific area. We're going to block this out. Now, layers and masks aren't used specifically just to work on the background. I use them in every facet of my retouching. If we look at the original file of this image that I worked on, you can see that I have a couple of folders and several layers here. I've got the original background layer, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 layers. I know this one looks weird, but this is all one layer. So at 10 different layers, and that's actually a low number of layers for the type of work that I usually do. But in this file, I have, if I turn off everything, you can kind of see what I've done here. Just go ahead and turn off all these layers. Okay, so the original image is here. And if I turn on the heel layer, this is where I've done little hair removals, tiny little blemish removal, things like that. The next 2 layers I've grouped together in a folder because they're technically one technique, but separated on 2 different layers. It's called Dodge and Burn. I can turn that on. You can see where I've dodged and burned, which helps me smooth out the skin a little bit. And again, the next 2 layers I've grouped together because they are related to one another. I have my curves and levels, which helps me add contrast and density to the image. And then I've got a color balance layer, which helps me shift the color a little bit, a hue and saturation layer, and a levels layer again to add a finishing pop of contrast. And then I've got a grain layer to add a little bit of noise. So you can see that I've done more than just background work. As a matter of fact, I didn't do any background work to this image, but it's still really important to work in layers, especially when you're doing things like retouching and color grading and things of that nature, because you may have a client who comes back and says, hey, you know, I really love the retouching on this, but the color is a little bit weird to me. Do you mind shifting it in this direction? Or the complete opposite might happen where they're like, hey, I love the color grading, but I feel like the retouching is a little much. Could you pull it back a little bit? And the answer is yes, I can, because you worked non-destructively. You have layers that you can go immediately to and drop the opacity or rework without having to affect other areas of the image or without having to start from scratch. So there you have it. That's how you're going to work with layers and masks. Again, remember to always name your layers and your groups so you don't get confused later, because the more layers you have, the more confusing it will get, I promise you. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. If you would like to have access to more in-depth tutorials, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, private lessons, and things like that, you can follow me on Patreon. If you want to see what I'm up to in between tutorial videos, you can also follow me on Instagram. All of these links will be in the information section below. If you have a better analogy for how layers and masks work or what has helped you understand that, please share that with me. I would love to know. And if you have any requests for content you'd like to see in the future, leave that in the comments below as well. And I would love to get to your questions. Thanks guys for joining me for this tutorial on how to use masks and layers for non-destructive editing, and I look forward to next time.